we find that both the medical profession authorities and church authorities and his fellow Christians reprimanded Blumhardt, warned him about praying for the sick because it was not supposed to happen in their day. Well, he tried to obey their demands and said that he would not lay hands on people, would not pray for them, but if they came to his meetings and they believed God and got healed, it was not his fault. And that's the way he ended that. However, in spite of that, the opposition grew. See, the devil was going to try to shut you down completely. He doesn't want you to just hinder you. He wants to shut you down like he did the Apostle Paul through that fallen angel that followed Paul around. So Blumhardt moved to a smaller town, or another town where he was not as well known, and yet people came to his meetings, his church services, and believed God, and the healings began to increase once again. Well, this is the one point I want to make in this lesson. Blumhardt learned some things by his observations of what was going on. What is this all about? What's happening here? And this is what he came up with. The first thing that is needed is the conversion of Christendom. See, this is in the 1800s, about 300 years after the onset of the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation wanted to correct the errors, gross errors of the Roman Catholic Church, which had happened during the Dark Ages, 500 to 1500. Well, now, 300 years later, Blumhardt sees the same basic things happening in the Protestant version of the church. I have observed the same. That's why some of my books have come about. My books are written largely to refute many errors in different denominational settings in the churches today. Blumhardt, from his Bible studies and observations of the poor church of his day, said that only a portion of the promises of God were fulfilled during the days of the apostles. Well, we have an opportunity to do even more if we believe God for that today, because people are still hurting. There were more people in the world then than before, and people are still hurting. They need help. Jesus healed by his compassion, but the church turned its back on that part of gospel ministry that Jesus established in the church. Well, there were other names. And the same thing happened to other seeking Christians who came from a wide variety of denominations: Puritan, Episcopalians, Baptists, and Presbyterians. Some from each of those groups rose up and believed God for the miraculous and got it, and were persecuted just like the rest of them. They were all eventually smothered. All these movements were eventually smothered by the opposition, not from outside the church so much as from inside the church itself. Like Francis McNutt said, the church, more than any other entity, is responsible for the church doing away with divine healing. One of those names that is very famous, probably most Christians, church members, have heard this name, Jonathan Edwards. He was a Puritan preacher, which is Calvinist in nature. He was part of a famous revival in Northampton, Massachusetts, 1734. Part of the beginning of what was called the Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening in America. But that revival lasted only about 2 years, and then it faded out because opposition arose to Edwards' ministry, and it came from theologians in his own denomination. When God began working with me to just study this subject and start preaching what I knew about it, opposition came from my own church denomination, other preachers. Two things in particular stirred up this controversy. One was that some of these people experienced overwhelming a sense of God's glory. And some of them were shaking, and some of them would lie down or, fall out under the power, as it said. Slain in the Spirit is called today in charismatic circles. So this became common later on, but at that time it was considered weird, and so it was put down and talked against, argued against. Also, remember that division between clergy and laity. During this time, some laymen from a nearby village made the audacious claim that laymen were capable of ministering to others, just like the ordained ministry, and they didn't believe that, even though Jesus taught it. Jesus did not teach clergy and laity. He taught believing and unbelieving, believers and unbelievers, saved and lost. This is seen as encroaching on the duty reserved only for the clergy. But the same man prophesied actually, that there would come a revival in this country in which the gifts of the Spirit would be released again as in the Acts of the Apostles. And that came to pass. It took some time for it to happen, but it did. Today, of course, these beliefs have become commonplace in some church circles, but in 1735 they were seen as heretical. So Edwards himself told this man that he was in error. Remember, Jonathan Edwards was a Calvinist, and he in part shut down that revival because of his own fears and unbelief coming out of that Calvinist system. Well, he tried to rekindle the revival, but it had died out. Again, he himself was part of the purpose because he believed in Calvinist doctrines which went contrary to what was happening by the Holy Spirit in his own church. He was a Puritan and a Calvinist. Now, he rediscovered some of the gifts of the Spirit, but he shut down that power by opposition, partly because of his own fears. See, religious tradition will cause fears in people. It causes fear in people. And so the devil operates through fear, and that's one way he shuts down these moves of God or prevents them from rising up. Next, we'll go on to another famous name in some circles, George Whitefield and the Great Awakening. So we'll pick that up in the next segment of these studies.